You can find two radical different ways of seeing nature, either as processes, and you can also see nature as a nature of parts. If you advocate the use of native plants only, is it a way of rejecting everything which is not from your own land? It's not because you design something that looks very diverse that you would come out 2 years from there and find exactly the same plants and that the diversity will have stayed the same. Are we part of nature or not?
That is Danielle Dagenais, professor in urban planning and landscape architecture at the University of Montreal and a specialist in garden design, ecology, plants, engineering and horticulture. Danielle studied a bachelor in plant science in 1981 and a master's in environmental engineering in 1986. After an impactful journey through Canada's agricultural industry, she obtained a PhD in environmental design in 2006. Danielle's incredible passion for plants and gardens has led her on a journey towards improving Canada's use of green infrastructure to promote stormwater management and urban biodiversity. My name is Peter Marksbach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, I got the chance to sit down with Danielle and discuss the apparent paradox of nature, humans' relationship to it, and its implications for the practice of green infrastructure. We cover plants, more plants, and how you should design and use plants in your city, given the urban, ecological, and societal challenges associated with them. We also hear Danielle's take on her key approaches to a successful and illustrious career. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at peterambach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. It is lovely to get this time to chat with you, Danielle. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
And it's my first time in Montreal, and I'm really enjoying my visit and really seeing what you're doing here at the university as well. So yeah, thanks for showing me around and for the opportunity.
Well, I'm really happy, and I wish I would have been able to bring you to all the outside sites where we are doing experiments at the Botanical Garden and, my favorite places in Montreal, but that's going to be for the next time.
And there'll certainly be a next time, so I definitely look forward to that. But as you already rightfully said, the key word, botanical, I think it'll be very interesting what we're going to discuss today, because if I had to pick someone who really works across disciplines, it would be you. Because you, in a way, you are a plant biologist, but you're also an environmental engineer and an expert in environmental design, and also a professor in an urban planning and landscape architecture school. So you've covered literally every aspect that is around plants and nature. So really excited to get into your story.
Yes, well, thank you again.
And as I was looking through some of the things you've been doing, I guess one nice place to begin with starts with a particular name. That name being Gilles Clément, and in particular in relation to this place in Paris, the Parc André Citroën in Paris. And you did a study on the design of this park, and in particular one interesting aspect, which is the garden movement. Could you illustrate that a bit?
Yes. Oh, you bring me back so many years ago. That's a long, long time ago. When I started my PhD, I was fascinated with the intersection between garden and ecology. And I thought that Gilles Clément's work, very famous French landscape architect from the, in year 2000, but he started much earlier than that. So that famous landscape architect was pioneering what would be called wasteland gardens in English, maybe. He was sort of putting wasteland, abandoned land, vegetation on stage in a way. That's what he did at Parc André Citroën. And what fascinated me is that it's nature, as you know, gardens are nature representing itself, or it translates the way you see a type of nature. And what is interesting in the Garden of Movement, it's one of the many gardens at Parc André Citroën, is that it represents an abandoned land. And you are convinced you're in an abandoned land when you are there. But in fact, when you study the planting, it's a lot of ornamental species. And for one paper, I compared the species that you found in a nearby abandoned land to the Jardin en Mouvement of Parc André Citroën. And actually, I think there were very, very few species that were in common. But they both were sort of abandoned land or wastelands or friche. And the public was sometimes deceived by this mock-up of friche. Maybe that's a bit what I wanted to unveil, but at the same time, it was done in a very clever way. And what was interesting is the maintenance challenge of that garden, because it was not cutting edges, like, straight edges and weeding and things like that. You really had to know the plants to know which ones you would choose, keep, and which one you would eliminate to achieve the desired effect. Yeah. That's in fact precisely what Gilles Clément was doing in his own garden in the Creuse, which I had the opportunity to visit. He sort of was digging a garden. Instead of planting things, he was carving a garden out of a friche, of an abandoned land. Okay. Friche, it doesn't have any translation in English. It's always a nightmare. Yeah. So, that's about Gilles Clément. And I had the chance to visit him and also some of his earlier period gardens, which I studied. And it was fascinating for, of course, the garden design aspect of it, but also the links to philosophy, like he was very fond of Michel Foucault, for example. At that period in the 80s, that's not when I studied it, but when the gardens were sort of conceived, there were lots of references to philosophers like Derrida, for example, or as I said, Michel Foucault in the work of French landscape designers. So that was a very rich period. Lots of great landscape design concours. It's not contest, but something like that. Lots of reflection, a big renewal in the way that the gardens were seen. And I think there has been some changes since then, but it was an interesting period to study. So that's what I would say about Gilles Clément, but I can expand, of course, if you wish.
And what I found interesting about this particular work is the real contradiction in what we defined as, I guess, nature, wild nature, and gardens. And that gardens, in fact, are, in a way, they go against the definition of what we would call nature or ecology, because it seems like the gardener seeks to achieve, a quote from your paper, an aesthetic and ecological balance, but nature itself or ecological processes want to be wild, as in growing and working in a way that is more natural and uncontrollable sometimes.
Yes, well, this idea of nature is also one thing on which I wrote an article. The idea of nature in garden design, and many other scholars have written about that. You can find two radical different ways of seeing nature. Either you see nature as processes, and this more the Odum type ecology, like the energy flow and all that. And you can also see nature as a nature of parts, like in biodiversity, where and I'm maybe taking shortcuts when I say that, but you see nature as being made of very valuable parts that you want to maintain or to keep. Of course, nature is both, but these two opposed conceptions of nature can be found in, national parks or in gardens as well. So maybe Clément was a bit more about processes, and some other gardens, and lots of them are about more the parts, the plants, and of course, all the design aspect. But you want to sort of stop the processes. You don't want weeds to come in. You want the plants to stay at their best all the time. It does change a little bit with people like Piet Oudolf. Is a Dutch plantsman. He did the Eyeline in New York. He did also Millennium Park in Chicago and many Battery Park in New York as well. And his philosophy is that It's also interesting to see the way the plants die, like what happens when it dries out in the fall and all that. And maybe I'm not so much up to date with garden design nowadays because I do more stormwater management and green infrastructure stuff. But yeah, it has changed. But at one point, you could see those two different conceptions of nature being present in gardens.
Yeah, almost like having to work with the paradox of process versus the objects, I guess.
Yes, that's it.
The form.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Just to make life more difficult, but I guess nature's complexity requires us to embrace it and to work with it. We see this in so many other disciplines as well.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I think we're very well positioned to understand that.
No, definitely. And so, as you said, you're now in stormwater, but I guess to get to that journey, we have to understand where it all began. So you started in plant biology and...
Agronomy, in fact.
That's what it's... Okay.
Plant science. So agricultural science, that's the name of my degree. With a specialization in plant science.
I never know what to call it because you have different terms. You got botany, you got horticulturalists, and you have, agro... how do you call it? You have agronomy.
Agronomy, yeah. If you look at my journey, I mean, academic journey, because there's lots of other journeys, but I was always studying disciplines of interventions, of trying to have an impact on the world, and we would say façonner in French, to create something. It's not just observing, which I say just observing. It's very important to observe and see the phenomena and record them and analyze and study them. But I was always more attracted to disciplines where you also intervene and do something. You know, agriculture is plant biology with a purpose.
Yep.
At first, when I came in, I thought I would feed the world. And then you read papers and books on, it's not a problem of production, it's a problem of distribution and blah, blah, blah. And then you think, okay. And then environmental engineering is about water and about pollution and all that, but not just studying it, but also trying to treat the water and do something about the problem. And environmental design or aménagement, or whether it be landscape architecture or urban planning, is also about changing things and improving them, hopefully.
And so what was the inspiration for the environment?
Oh, that will seem so basic, but I guess a love of nature and confidence, but that's not the right word. The conviction, conviction, if that's an English word.
It is.
That the environment has an impact on you, and that you have experiential connection to the world. And so the way the world is important to you as a human being and also for other beings. So I guess that's the main... Yeah, and also, I think I was always fascinated with water. My mom used to say that every time we would go and walk in the forest, we would come back all wet because somehow we managed to go in a stream or anywhere where you would have a significant amount of water, and that's true. So I guess that was reflected in my educational choices later on.
That combined with the feeling that intervention is important, we shouldn't just observe, we should be able to understand how to then make a difference in the world, to design solutions that create more sustainable delivery of services, be it food, be it, livable environments.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yes. And improving the environment is also improving the common good.
True.
So it's not only good for one person, like if I would be a doctor in regular medicine, not public health, but you improve the life of one individual at a time. It's a noble task. But if you work at a greater scale, you work on the environment, well, then you improve the life of many others. So, yeah.
I can certainly relate to that. And I also make it my active mission to try and create solutions that help entire cities, the groups of individuals, in a way, have a better environment to live in and to be protected against the challenges we face. And to hopefully, through this podcast as well, communicate the messages of others with similar passions.
I hope so.
Yeah. So you did your bachelor's in 1981, then you went into a master's, so that discipline shift occurred. and you finished that in 1986. But it wasn't until 2000 when you then pursued your PhD. What happened in between that period?
Oh la la, many, many things. When I finished my master's, it was not a good time to look for jobs. So I guess the younger generation will probably not be able to relate to that. But really, and it's funny because I thought with plant science and environmental engineer, haven't I a winning combination? You know.
You'd think so, yeah.
You think so, but obviously, at that time, no. So I went to engineering companies and all that. And no, it didn't appear so interesting for them, this combination. So I found jobs more in communication than, or little things like the Ministry of Environment, where I was in charge of inspecting buildings for indestructible pollutants. So all sorts of little jobs, like there was a research project at the Botanical Garden on the multiplication of aquatic plants from the St. Lawrence. This was for a big project called Projet Archipel. So we're a group of young people going in the river at the very cold times to find roots of some aquatic plants.
That's quite hard to imagine. I mean, for those who don't know the geography, the St. Lawrence River, it runs past Montreal and it's massive. If you look on the map, it's a massive river and it's got a massive flow rate. At least I've certainly taken the train across the bridges of the St. Lawrence. I can't imagine there being a lot of aquatic plants anchoring themselves or at least growing in that river.
Well, you have some shores along Montreal, and we went to some islands close to Montreal in the St. Lawrence, and we were harvesting, usually sections of roots and things like that would be used to multiply some plants at the Botanical Garden. So the greenhouses where I had some research projects recently, or close to which I have actual projects. Well, a colleague and I have actual projects were the greenhouses where we used to bring the plants at that time.
Oh, wow.
So I have a long relationship with the Botanical Garden, but with interruptions at times. So I did that type of job. And also, after a while, I found a very interesting job in Ottawa.
Okay.
I was in a lobby group working for Dairy Farmers of Canada. Okay. So something pretty different from plant science, but I was an agronomist, and so we had to add animal science courses. So I was not totally strange for me to work for milk producers or dairy farmers. I really enjoyed my job, stayed there for almost 2 years. I was in charge of research and communications, and very funny, like being the coordinator, but the only one.
Interesting.
Interesting time in our capital in Canada, where you have this sort of schizophrenic situation where my boss was Francophone, that sort of was not speaking English when he came to Ottawa, and after a few years, he was not able to speak really French anymore. And so we have to hand out our papers in English and to supervise the translation in French, which was a bit strange. But I really appreciated the producers. They were very interesting people. That was at that time where we were negotiating the first trade agreement between the US and Canada. And it was fascinating to be at the heart of the political world and one of the important lobby group in agriculture. But at the same time, you had opposite lobby group who wanted to expand the trade, whereas we wanted to keep the borders closed because of the quota system, which you have in some countries in Europe, I guess. So that was quite interesting. But when I became pregnant of my first child, actually, when I gave birth, I decided to slow down because at that time, it was not really possible to do that job part-time. It's either you were there 5 days a week and traveling all over the country and all that.
And committed to the cause, essentially. They always expect that.
Yeah. They would expect that, and which was okay at the time. But then I decided to switch and do more freelance work of agricultural journalism and column writing on gardens in newspapers and all that. So, a change of career. True. At that time. So I published a book from my columns at that time as well. So, but when did I decide to go back for the PhD? I was invited to a conference on art and gardens at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal. And then I met the professor who was going to be my supervisor afterwards. And we discussed and all that. And I thought, well, why not?
Why not?
It's going to be more relaxed than writing columns. What a error. You think, okay, no, it's not relaxed at all. And after 2 years, they needed somebody to teach the plants courses, and they opened a position and I applied. So I was sort of doing my PhD and being half a professor at the same time. So that was a bit hectic.
It's like PhD, it's one topic, 3 years. How hard can it be, right?
So that's it, yeah. But it was also a different... I had to learn how to speak design language.
Is that quite different? I mean, I did read that.
It's totally different, or more social science type of thing.
Yeah, the work on Gilles Clément was quite different in writing style compared to some of the later papers that you have.
Yes, of course. And you have to really dig into concepts and theories and philosophy. And it's a different way of approaching things. But I was happy because I had always been sort of hesitating between more social science, arts, and sciences, and I like both. So that gave me the possibility to do that, but it was hard to understand how much it's important to define concepts and how much everything that you do in your methodology has to be clearly deriving from the concept that you use, and all this sort of internal validity of your work is so important. I'm not saying it's not important, it's science, but I find there's more implicit things, whereas we had to be very explicit. So I think that was a useful experience as well.
Yeah, having delved into social science myself and appreciating the technical, the natural sciences, I can definitely relate to having a good concept or framework in the case of social science.
Yes.
Because that structures your thinking, it structures your approach. And whilst in the natural sciences, we know there's a lot more as research questions and hypotheses and approaches from which you analyze it. In the social science, it's really how you frame the whole thing. From what lens or perspective are you looking at? As you said just now, in terms of nature, in terms of processes or parts. So now I certainly can relate. And once you combine the two disciplines, I think that's probably, would you agree, the key to helping you reconcile how two different disciplines work?
Yeah, I see myself as a mediator.
Yeah.
A person, a translator. I'm able to understand why I have some social science colleagues talk, and I can explain to my engineering colleagues what they mean by what they say. And I can sometimes appreciate the incomprehensiveness between the two, and it's just that you don't speak the same language and you use sometimes the same words. They don't mean the same things.
That is true.
Or sometimes it's that you mean the same thing, but you just use different words. So I like this position. It's uncomfortable at times.
At times, yeah.
Because we can say jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think nowadays, in this world of ours, I think this type of perspective is important. Not the only one, but important.
And with it, interdisciplinary work, and we've covered this on the podcast many times, but we really talk of that T-shaped professional where you need to be deep in one discipline, but be able to work across them. And I think the mediation is so critical nowadays, or even translation, if you want to call it that. And being able to do that and being open to other disciplines, I think will get us very far, and in collaborating together.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And it's enjoyable to, it's like also traveling in the world of knowledge, because when you work, in some projects we worked with acousticians, we worked on noise screens and things like that, or working with environment, maybe with hydrologists, or, it's always different. You find you learn things. You're in a perpetual learning environment.
And this is actually a perfect opportunity to get into where you are situated now, which is the green infrastructure space. And mainly in terms of stormwater, but also I think the role you play is very critical in terms of the plants as well, or understanding the plants within the system, or vegetated systems as we would call them. But I guess probably the first point of call that I always ask my guests, what is your preferred term? I see you use green infrastructure a lot. Is that the main term you like to use?
I feel more at ease with green infrastructure because it has a resonance, both in plant biology, botany, and landscape architecture. So it's more related to the disciplines that I work in and with. Mm-hmm. Whereas I'm not so comfortable with the nature-based solutions, maybe because nature is such a polysemic term. It can mean so many things. Well, if you read all the scholars who have written on the idea of nature, what is nature and all that, you think it's not a word that should be used lightly. So what do we mean by nature-based solutions? And implicitly, nature-based solution, it means plants and soil, mostly. But, you know, how about animals, insects, and all that? And are we part of nature or not? That's another question.
That is true. Technically, we should be, right?
Yeah.
We are mammals.
Yeah, so that's why I don't feel comfortable with this term. Whereas green infrastructure comes from landscape architecture and stormwater management. There has been a very good study. The author, we did a literature review on the different understanding or use of green infrastructure and in which disciplines it was used and all that. And it was mainly used in stormwater management, but also for biodiversity and land planning, I think.
You're talking about Professor Ian Mell?
No, it's Maestlер or something like
Matzler.
that. Matzler, yeah. I really enjoyed it.
The Matzler paper, came out recently.
Yes, I think it's a good paper because it reflects also, as I said before, the disciplines in which I work, with which I interact. Whereas nature-based solutions, its history is more in nature conservation, and that's a different world.
That is true.
I see that nowadays we have to put this name in our proposals, in papers and all that. And I think part of the green infrastructure or all of the green infrastructures are nature-based solutions, but some nature-based solutions are not green infrastructures. But I think I would be stretching what I do if I would use that term, or I'm very cautious when I use it. And when I give a course on green infrastructure and phytotechnologies, and then I talk about nature-based solutions, but I explain why maybe in the context of this course, it would be stretching the knowledge or the base of the course a bit too far.
Too far, yeah. And so I tend to use nature-based solutions being buzzwordy. And also for me, nature-based solutions does relate to much broader kind of scales of solutions.
True.
But when I'm in the city, I tend to use blue-green infrastructure. So I explicitly express the blue in the water in the term. You obviously talked about how stormwater and green infrastructure, they're sort of implicit because one relates from that field, the other one from the landscape field. But where does water sit in this definition? You just assume it's implicit.
No, well, yeah. Well, actually, my lab's name is the Laboratory on Blue-Green Infrastructure. So I do use it, but not as if I would be working on streams or rivers or lakes per se. But yes, of course, there's always water involved if you're working on stormwater. Of course.
Yeah, but I thought it's nice to have this conversation because you are part of the group of authors that created one of the first really explicit papers on terminology in this field that has explored many different avenues and how it sort of emerged. And since then, the paper we mentioned by Matzler has come out to expand upon that. But in a way, you really looked into that together with a few other colleagues that we also know as mutual friends and contacts. I know one of them will certainly be listening into this episode. He's already expressed that interest.
Oh my God. Okay.
But don't worry, we'll get him on the show at some point as well. So yeah, it was good to hear your opinion on that. And so terminology aside, in a way, you approach this from the stormwater management perspective quite a lot, especially in some recent publications, and in particular around the idea of bioretention systems or biofiltration systems. Again, terminology, different styles. Yes. But what was the hook to get you into that? I guess intervention, right?
Yeah, at first, in terms of, I was interested in the phytotechnologies, okay? So we could say blue-green infrastructures, but at the system level.
Yep.
I know it's a term that is not widely used, but it's used here. So things like green roofs, bioretentions, wind edges, and whatever. So again, once there was the thesis defense of one of my PhD colleagues, and then I met my colleague Jacques Brisson from the Institute of Research on Plant Biology, and he was working on constructed wetlands.
Okay.
And we had a mutual contact, a common friend, I would say. Well, a colleague, and for him, a friend. And I talked to him, and we sort of concluded that, well, he was a bit in advance compared to me in that respect, but we concluded that it would be necessary to create a Quebec Society for Phytotechnology, because at the Botanical Garden, they were working on phytoremediation, on constructed wetlands. I was interested in doing some research on green roofs, more on the appreciation of green roof, though, so more the social aspect.
Yeah.
And so the Quebec Phytotechnology Society was created then. So yes, of course, green roofs are about stormwater management and other benefits. But soon it became very clear that finding funding for that was not going to be easy. And this discipline was already quite
saturated.
Yeah. And in a way, working on the ground was more interesting. And we had made a few proposals on working on plans for bioretentions and all that, but it didn't work out. And finally, with a colleague from Polytechnique, Sarah Dorner, and with Uranos, who's a consortium on climate change, we designed a project to work on bioretentions in Trois-Rivières and see how the plants were doing and the contribution of plants to performance. There was also a experimental aspect to that, which Henri Béral, our student who graduated not too long ago. So there was a experimental aspect in the greenhouse on that. So we really could study the role of different plant species. Not that it was the first experiment done on that. There were some experiments at Monash, I guess, or U of Melbourne, I guess, at that time on this topic. But we thought that it could be expanded considerably.
Definitely.
So,
in particular, the Canadian climate being very different as well.
Yes. So we started on that. At the same time, I was contacted by the Ministry of Transport, and then my colleague Jacques accepted to work on the project with me, but we were contacted by them to see what's the effect of the vegetated strips along highways on stormwater management. So this is a very applied research contract, not necessarily a research grant. But still, it was interesting to see that, well, it worked beautifully, thanks to the fact that it was very well drained in part. But
good design.
Good design. Well, it's also part of the road design. But anyways, so we had suddenly lots of projects coming in on stormwater. And because my environmental engineering was mostly about treating water, mostly wastewater, but still, you know, I felt I had the right tool to work on stormwater. And also, I have to go back. I had forgotten that I had started to work on stormwater much earlier than that, in fact. In 2010, it's true, it's not so experimental, but I had a project with Uranos, again, on adaptation to climate change through the implementation of green infrastructure in the cities. We had a very basic way of looking at constraints and benefits, and with overlaying of maps, finding the right spots to implement. Yep. So sort of a
screening tool.
Screening, it was not a very sophisticated tool, but still we took into consideration things like road security, so mobility, places where you had urban flood problems and all that. This was in an area in Quebec City, so we were doing some more planning. It was a decision aid tool, but with decision tree, like you use in a botanical key when you say not a multi-criteria key, but
heuristics in a way.
Yes, you go, okay, this or that, okay, this or that, and then you make choices.
And you follow the string.
Yeah, that's it. So that was a big project, took us like 2 or 3 years, and we did publish on that. So that was, yes, one of the first projects on stormwater, and then this project
snowballed.
Yeah, that's it, snowballed.
Quite literally. I mean, in Canada, it's very appropriate.
It is.
With the snow.
Nowadays, it is. Maybe it's not going to be in a few years, but for now, yes.
I guess we'll see. But from that mapping level down to the technology itself, and you've had a few publications that really touch upon how we should be designing these systems, maybe even debunking some of the myths in the design guides. And so I thought this would be a nice opportunity to maybe go through some of these aspects, and you can tell me what your recommendation or professional experience is with these.
Okay.
I guess the first hypothesis that you set out to test is that planted or vegetated systems are better than unvegetated systems. And this seems to have been proven over and over again in the scientific literature.
Yes, it has. And we always have no plants control. And we find that there is a difference, of course. A difference in terms of volume reduction, at least importantly during the growing season. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because of transpiration, but I would say evapotranspiration as well, because the plants dry out the substrate, so more space to water retention. In terms of peak flow, in that paper, because I'm also thinking of more recent studies that we did, well, there were some questions about whether our plants help or do not help that much permeability. By the way, this was more Tim's part in the paper, as you can guess.
Tim Fletcher, as you're referring to.
Yeah, Tim Fletcher. And in fact, it's from this review, yes, it helps. What we found, though, in our experiments in the greenhouse, I would say Henri Béaral's experiment, is that, in fact, when you are in columns, somehow we had very good growth of the plants. And in fact, the plants slowed down peak flow.
Okay.
Probably because, well, the mass of roots. We had some also good growth of roots in the field in our Trois-Rivières experiment, but there was some over-efficient design of the bioretention, so it's difficult to see what the effects of the plants were on that. But anyways, I think that plants still help maintain permeability, but it also depends if the plants are very much contained or if it's a more open system, I guess.
And you mentioned columns just now, I guess, to illustrate to listeners who may not be familiar with the experimental procedure. In greenhouse experiments and in controlled environments, oftentimes these plants are planted in PVC pipes or what we call columns, smaller boxes to do the experiments in. And so I guess it makes sense if you have a plant in a column, there's limited space for the roots and the roots will just really spread out.
Yes, and to the effect that they can clog pores in a way, but I think that's an artifact of the experimental way of studying things. And in fact, I should say they were not in columns, they were in planter boxes, but still we observed that effect, or we hypothesize that the observed effect is due to root density.
But nevertheless, roots have an influence, but it's also dependent on how much water goes into the system.
Yes, of course, of course. Yeah, for pollutants, what we found is that, for example, for nitrogen, plants do have an effect. They absorb nitrogen. So yes, it has an effect. For metals, it's less important. Some people are speaking of using hyperaccumulator plants in bioretentions and all that, but I'm not too confident that it would work. But hyperaccumulators most of the time are very small, and you have to harvest them to really remove the metals. So it's a different way of maintaining the bioretention. So I'm not sure about that. So metals, the plants are in general not so important. For phosphorus absorption, a little bit, but mostly it's the substrate. As for metals, how about hydrocarbons? Hydrocarbons, it's mostly, the flora around the rhizosphere, which is acting up because, of course, the plants, except if it's a very small molecule and you do phytovolatilization, it's usually degraded. So it's not the plants, it's really the microbiota around the roots. But at the same time, the plant definitively has an impact on all the other benefits that you can get from bioretentions. So it has an effect on treatment. It has an effect on volume reduction and maybe, infiltration. But it also allows to have benefits in terms of biodiversity, well-being, things like that.
And it just looks better. I mean, who wants to have a bare soil trench outside their house?
Yes. No, nobody wants to have that.
So that's good. Take good business case for these systems. I guess the second hypothesis is that species will differ in terms of effectiveness. So the type of plant becomes important.
Yes. Well, in fact, we found that for volume reduction, unsurprisingly, the shrub, we had herbaceous species I'm speaking of an experiment, but in the paper, I have to sort of differentiate the two, but in the paper, we also found that species could have an effect. And that's also what we found in the experiments.
And I know from colleagues in Australia that they have been using different plant species to test, and they do see that some are much better in also just taking all the pollutants that's being thrown at them and the volumes of water that is being thrown at the system.
Yes, but that's also one aspect that we are interested in. It's not only plants helping the performance, but the resilience of plants towards stormwater. One of the projects we're working on right now is about the way how much trees can withstand stormwater, especially stormwater with salt.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, that's an important thing. It's not only that planting green infrastructure everywhere in the city. You want them to grow and to stay green. So
Indeed.
They have to withstand conditions.
We have the terms greenfield and brownfield, but it certainly should never be the case in green infrastructure and brown infrastructure.
No, not at all.
No, definitely. So species matter. And also a lot of this comes from knowledge in phytoremediation work as well, because I guess when you do phytoremediation, there are, again, the selection of species to do that is very important.
Yes. My colleagues who work at the Botanical Garden on phytoremediation, they work on willows.
Okay.
Instead of working on hyperaccumulator, the rationale for that is that although they don't absorb in terms of concentration, if you look at the concentration of pollutants in their leaves or the wood and all that, it's not that big, but because they have such a big biomass, in the end, it's important. And also, it's more interesting visually, also a refuge for the bird. So it has other benefits.
And not to mention the carbon as well. When we think of carbon sequestration, we got to remember, we can just plant all the forests, but if the forests die off, that carbon is released again somehow.
Exact.
So biomass accumulation, very important.
Yeah. So yes, species are important. And we need to know more about not only species. We could have worded this hypothesis differently in terms of functional traits.
Okay.
Because in horticulture, we used functional traits before to choose species. That was not as scientifically defined as it is today. But you could be able to say that plants that have such and such characteristics should do well in the garden at such and such place. Functional traits, it's a bit like that. Is you want to find characteristics of plants that make them either better, help to improve the performance of bioretentions or other green infrastructure, and also characteristics that help them withstand the conditions. So the adaptation and the performance. So that's been studied in ecology, biology, and genetics for a long time. There's lots of people interested in that today in green infrastructure.
I've certainly encountered that term as well in some of the biodiversity research I've been undertaking with colleagues. So, and that also links again to the next hypothesis, which is native species are better than exotic species. I guess from biodiversity perspective, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? But
Well, it's interesting. There's no, or maybe we have new findings on that, but at the time when the review was made, there was no proofs, no results indicating that, in fact, native plants were more adapted to bioretentions or even the urban environment. Considering that the urban environment, at least in Montreal, for example, doesn't resemble at all what the natural environment is. You know, it's drier, it's hotter.
Yep.
The soil is not a forest soil because here the native vegetation is naturally it becomes a forest. We don't have really grasslands.
There is alteration from the urbanization and the paving.
Yes.
Just changes everything, yes.
Yes, so we're in a very different condition than the natural situation. So then why would native species perform better or be more adapted? But if we want to prevent invasive plants from coming in, then there's a principle of precaution. And then you think, well, by using native plants, maybe we are less likely to come up with invasive species, because you can have invasive native species, but it's not as frequent. And one thing about native plants, and I tell that to the students when I teach plants or botany type of classes, is native to where? Because if you, well, Canada is a huge country. The province of Quebec itself is a huge territory. Native plants from Shefferville or Abitibi up north, would it be really happy in Montreal? I'm not sure. And same for native plants from the Montreal area. Would it fare well even in Bécomo or other municipalities in our province? So
different climate zones, different areas, different species, I guess. And this we have to be careful of as well, not to think in terms of country boundaries, but also mainly in terms of the different biospheres and the different biomes that we will encounter.
Yeah, and even smaller than that, because, for example, in Montreal, we would share some plants with the northern USA, as you say.
True.
Same biome, but biomes are quite extended pieces of land, and you have sub-biomes, I would say, within that.
Oh, just to make things more complicated,
Yeah, well, if you're in wetland or if you're in a forest, up a hill or down at the bottom, you don't find the same plants. And, you know, you have to qualify what you mean by native. Again, this question of concept. And the concept of native is also very political, and there's been a lot of discussion about if you advocate the use of native plants only, is it a way of rejecting everything which is not from your own land? And then it comes to how much you accept strangers and all that. So you always have to be cautious when you speak about that. But anyways, in terms of the principle of precaution, we advocate to use native plants as much as possible. But sometimes if you are in a super difficult environment, like in the side of the street, which lots of salts are used during the winter, well, maybe the native tree, if you want also a diversity of functional traits, well, maybe you won't use only native plants.
And this links nicely to then the fourth point of that one review out of the 5 aspects that I want to cover, which is monocultures versus a diversity of species. And it seems that you may have to mix and match the different species because there could be some benefit in having a diversity of plants in your systems.
Yes, although there were not really concluding experiments on bioretention at that time on diversity. Again, this is more by reasoning. You think that it would be advisable to use a diversity of plant forms, not really plant species, but plant forms like herbaceous plants, shrubs, and trees to have different layers. Then you have more possibility of transpiration, for example, more shade. Maybe it will be more hospitable for biodiversity and all that. And also, we seldom study the underworld, like the roots and all that. But different plants have different rooting strategies, so maybe you can exploit the substrate better. And so, as I said, I don't think there are many results on that at the moment, but maybe a few papers. But you would think that that it's a good strategy. But at the same time, as an agronomist, I know that you can have some competition. So it's not because you design something that looks very diverse that you would come out 2 years from there and find exactly the same plants and that the diversity will have stayed the same. We are monitoring a water square and a few bioretentions, and we find that, of course, like in any plantings, some species are really expanding, they are happy, everything goes well, and they are becoming big and full of water and everything, and they just shade their neighbors, which gradually becomes smaller and smaller and finally disappears or dies.
It's the paradox that you also made a good point of in your paper on designing with nature, where you talked about biodiversity, but on the other hand, this idea of ecological succession, which is a natural progression. And if you put many species together, it may just happen that one of them dominates the others and you have this change in ecology.
Yes, and of course, if you don't weed your bioretention in our biome in Montreal, you will soon get a little forest, that's for sure. And maybe that's not what you want.
But maybe how we want nature to be, who knows? Coming back to, I guess, the early paper.
Yes. But you have to take into account the needs of humans in a city. So it's a delicate balance between the needs of humans and all the benefits to want to get from blue-green infrastructure and the needs of the other beings that are non-human.
Definitely. And so this brings us to that last point about the design, which is it's unique to a lot of the northern countries in Canada, Europe, and the US as well, because Australia never faces this problem with exception of some cities, and that is snow and winter, and where the temperatures can drop to, what do we have it here in Montreal? -10 for longer periods of time?
Not necessarily for longer period of time. Well, last year I was traveling in Australia, and at the same time, I think for a few days, it was almost -30 or something like that.
Jeez.
So really cold. Well, the vegetation, the cold is not a problem. Our plants are meant to survive the cold, and you have plants up north, no problem. The challenge is more the swings between cold and mild temperature in the winter.
Okay, yep.
It's not always good. We had a quite severe frost storm, a freezing rain, and you should have seen all the trees. There were so many branches fallen off the trees. And this was, I guess, in April this year. I'm not sure about the date, but it was stunning. We had a previous freezing rain storm a long time ago where we lost electricity for days, like 10 days in some places in the middle of the winter. That was something. But this was a freezing rain storm. Well, in spring, you don't expect that.
No.
So that was shocking, and it really damaged trees. So that type of thing, or if you have a milder period in the middle of the winter, it can be damaging. Or we had something which was really bad for fruit trees and trees as well, severe frost in the month of May.
Oh, geez.
Yes. And then
it should be summer by then.
It should
Almost.
be, but yes, lots of apple producers lost part of their harvest and all that. So I think the climate instability is challenging for the vegetation, as well as new pests and diseases coming in. And more than the cold. A good normal cold with lots of snow, no problem. It's good for the vegetation. It's just when you have unexpected milder period, less snow, more ice, then it's challenging.
And I guess one aspect of that is also being able to understand the dynamics of snow and snow melts, because ultimately these systems also have to deal with the water. And if that water is not flowing when you're expecting it to, but later on when the temperatures warm up, you're going to have to also deal with that. And that was a study that you undertook with your colleague where you also looked at the dynamics of this.
Yes, that was mainly a study done by Garance Goujon, a student at École Polytechnique, the engineering school, and this was with my colleague Françoise Bichay. Actually, what Garance found, but it was mainly modeling, is that snow is sort of a reservoir of water. It's a good way to store water.
True.
But unfortunately, it melts at some point. But somehow it was beneficial to have snow in terms of CSOs and all that, if I remember well, this study, which was less, I should say, my study than other ones that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But the studies that we are doing right now and that Henri did also was about salt, and this is specific to winter. So one problems that you have for urban trees, urban vegetation is salty runoff.
So de-icing salt that they apply to the roads as well, maybe,
yes,
to allow the cars to not slide around.
The salt that you use in your kitchen, most of the time, it's the same type of soil, but maybe a little bit more contaminants, but it just makes the life a bit harsher for the plants because it changes the soil. It also, the ice melts. And then the cars, and especially the bigger trucks, they go in the streets and it splashes.
Yep.
They have some salty splash. This goes on the trees and can be quite damaging.
Okay.
So it depends on the size of the cars or trucks, the intensity of the traffic and all that, but it can really damage trees. We have an elevated highway in Montreal called Autoroute Métropolitaine, and the trees that are on the side that receives wind from the highway, you can see that they have what we call witch's broom.
Witch's broom?
Witch's broom is like lots of little, not stems, but branches that grow from the same point.
Okay.
You find that can be caused by mycoplasmas or aphids or things like that. But in that case, it's just the fact that the salty spray comes on a bud and it sort of burns the bud, and then it triggers a multiplication of secondary branches, of small branchlets. So it's very unaesthetic, and at some point, if it's too severe, it can be very bad for the tree. So that's one impact of winter, which can be bad for vegetation, trees especially.
I actually always thought it was about the soil, but you can actually have some serious impact if it gets to the leaves through splashing or to the branches.
Well, hopefully the leaves are not there, but the buds, if they are not well protected, because some species, they hide their buds.
Okay.
And they are not so much exposed to the salt sprays, but other species, they have more fragile buds and they are more prone to witch's broom. We don't study this aspect in our work on the impact of salt on trees. We're just looking at runoff, but this is also an important aspect. And by the way, this study, I was mentioning it was my study, but it was my colleague Jacques Brisson and also colleagues from UQAM like Alain Paquette, who is actually the PI on that.
But wonderful collaborations, and really the outcome is a much better understanding of how we can work with plants to help us create better stormwater management and at the same time more livable environments, in a way fulfilling the intervention aspect that you're so passionate about. And so where do you think we're heading with this? Are we able to implement these ideas into the design, or is guidance for these systems still behind?
Okay, many things. The guidance for the systems are sometimes much ahead of the science.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
so the other way around.
You have some recommendations for species, and this has not been studied experimentally. Some species are recommended because they work well and they seem to survive, but we don't really know if they contribute to the right performance. And even some species that are recommended, if you look at them in many different systems, you don't necessarily find that they are doing so well. So, well, the paper that you mentioned previously, the 2018 paper with Brisson and Fletcher, was about that. Are we getting the right guidance in terms of plant design in bioretention? And I think that now, well, we still have lots of scientific results to get before really being confident that what we recommend is right.
But it seems like there's a will to try in practice more and then validate later than not try at all.
Yes. That, well, just out of necessity. I mean, the cities, they are eager to have bioretentions. If they have to wait for us to be subsidized, to be funded, or if we are waiting for them to fund us, they do, but not to the extent that would be needed in some instances. Well, then nothing would happen. So they want to go to get ahead and they plant, and well, it's okay. They sort of learn from their error, and it's what we call adaptive design, and it's very important. And one thing maybe that I forgot to mention about salt is we are very worried about the impact of salt on roots and soil. Mm-hmm. But in fact, there are many trees and plants that survive in cities, even when you have salty streets. So I'm really eager eager to see the results of our studies on trees, where we will be studying salt only, not runoff and all that, because we might find, as we did find on the study on herbaceous plants and shrubs, that maybe the effects are not so great. So maybe it takes many, many, many years before you see an effect, unless you put salt straight on the plant.
I think it's fascinating where we're heading. And I think that's also an encouragement to practitioners, try. And I think scientists will be there to back you in any way possible. But I think definitely try, because it is a necessity to combat a lot of the challenges we face in urban environments.
Yes, and sometimes we think as scientists that we know everything, but the practitioners, they do R&D at their own scale, and they don't necessarily share their results because this is part of their business. But they do sort of little trials. It's not experiments, but trials, and they accumulate knowledge. And it's too bad that this is not shared, because that would make other people avoid mistakes. Because as we know, well, in science it's the same, but if something fails, you don't really report on that.
Yeah.
But it's as important as reporting what works. So they record that, the practitioners, and they know things, but we don't necessarily know what they know.
Learning from failures. I once spoke to a practitioner in this, we call it water-sensitive urban design in Australia, in that space. And yeah, she was saying we need a big book of failures to learn from, because I think trial and error is still something that teaches us the way we should do things and the way we can optimize things. But I guess you'll be there at the forefront watching how this unfolds. And is there another discipline that you plan to integrate? I did notice in some of your work you've touched upon heat islands now recently.
Yes, well, I'm on a project with another colleague from another university, Carly Zitter. She works on heat islands, but I'm not part of the heat island team myself. But I wish I would be able to make experiments on the impact of bioretentions on heat, because it's something that we claim, but has not been measured a lot. Like many of the benefits, you know, when you see a city wants to implement a blue-green infrastructure, you have a list of benefits that are expected, but we don't always know how many of these benefits are actually realized or occurring. And there are also some benefits that you don't think of, but are happening and are there.
Pleasant surprises, I guess.
Yes, so monitoring is very important for that.
Indeed. Then I look forward to seeing how a lot of these projects you talked about will pan out in the next few years, and to then catch up again at some point to look into that and see where the practice is heading. Danielle, this has been a very wonderful and wide-ranging talk around this idea of using plants and nature in cities. And it was lovely to hear all the different ways we can think about it and what we must do. Like I do with every guest, I'd love to get into some questions that I ask all my guests so they can learn even more about you and how you think and your journey as well. We've covered quite a lot, but I guess going through all of that, you've talked about your inspiration for intervention, coupling that with the science. And in a way, when you get up every day nowadays, what is that inspiration that drives you forward?
As I said, improving the day-to-day environment of people, the people around me. Yes, I think that's my main inspiration, working for the community here at the university or in my neighborhood and in the city. So yeah, that's my inspiration.
Definitely hasn't changed since then. I think it's just gotten stronger since. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about the current situation that we're in, so you could do it overnight with the wave of the wand, what would it be?
Remove the excess greenhouse gases, I guess. Yeah, because I like the fact that the things are changing, but it's changing fast, and so many people suffer from that, yeah, definitely I would do that.
I guess it's in a way buying time, because it feels like, I don't know, every year we feel like we've gone 10 years into the future with climate change, and it's like, hang on, slow down. We need to find the solutions, and we have them, but we need to get to that implementation.
Well, one anecdote is that I remember when we were in Ottawa, we had some friends, and he was, I guess, a geologist or something like that, and he was telling us that's in the 80s that we would be going through a next ice age.
In the 80s.
And
Wow.
so, yeah, I feel that's not exactly the direction that we're taking right now. I wouldn't be happy with an ice age. For example, here there were kilometers of ice over our head
Yeah.
10,000 years ago.
Probably not the best situation to be in.
No, that's it. But yeah, definitely slowing down gas emission, finding a way to change our way of life without constraining people. All things I would like to do.
Spoilt for choice,
Yeah.
but certainly a relevant one. Was there a key moment, book, seminar, event, or person that completely changed the course of your career or your mindset?
As you can see, I changed paths many times. So there's been many important person, I guess. Yes, for the PhD, I think that changed, of course, my career. Beside the fact that I was interested in a PhD, I'd been interested for a long time and all that. It's also when I was invited at that conference and in fact, discussions and with my sister-in-law, who was a professor in numerical arts at that time.
Numerical arts, okay.
Yeah, inspired me to try things and go further, I guess. Yeah.
I haven't heard of numerical arts, but it certainly sounds, I guess, how do you say, avant-garde and fascinating.
It was at
to
the
dig in.
moment. Maybe it's not anymore.
Okay.
But with, yeah.
Yeah, if you know people can innovate in that direction, then why not from where you are?
I think I have to pay a tribute to my parents because choosing to do a PhD, my mom was in avant-garde in a way because as I did, she went back to do her PhD when we were, I guess I was around 8 years old or something like that. And, you know, so many years ago, that was not so common to do a PhD in economics.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I guess that was a far inspiration, maybe not what triggered me to do the PhD at that precise moment, but, you know, the family background of my two parents being PhDs and one researcher and the other one chair of department, I guess that had an influence in the end.
Oh, yeah. No, definitely. You mentioned your PhD supervisor whom you met at that conference that also, in a way, set you on a course to where you are now. So
Yes. And later going through the seminars here, which are where you had to read some seminal works by philosophers, planners, architects, and all that, just to have the intellectual framework necessary to operate in this field. That was also important, yeah.
definitely. What was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career to date? And how did you overcome it?
Well, I've had many challenging situations in my career. I guess as school chair, I won't go through all the situations, but you encounter many human challenges. And it's always the human variable because you have lots of decisions and always little crises and emergencies and problems to solve. I had more challenges than as a researcher. Yes, sometimes the experiment doesn't go like you want, or you have a field experiment and blah, blah, blah. Yes, we did have some problems, but somehow you're always a bit further. It doesn't have such a personal impact. But as a chair of the department, you interact with people and you have students and people depend on you. So it's a more emotional implication, I would say.
I guess, the emotional connection you make because you want to make sure that you are equal to people, that you give them a comfortable experience, that you're there to cater to their needs, but their wishes and career goals as well. And sometimes there will be conflicts. This, in the end, bears an emotional burden when it just takes a lot of energy from you. And then you lose that sight of, the research you're trying to do on the side.
Yes, maybe doing research and teaching and being a chair was a challenge. Yeah.
But nevertheless, it seems that you've been able to handle it because a lot of fascinating stuff has been emerging. I think you have a very good teaching program. And we are sitting here today and chatting about this journey. So definitely an inspiration to many, I think, wanting to take on more roles as they go deeper into their academic career as well.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize that departments, schools, university, they just don't function by themselves. And if you don't get implicated, you don't assume any role and just let it work for you. Well, maybe it won't go in the direction you want first. And also it's a bit unfair because some others are doing extra work.
And ultimately, we are supposed to be seen as teams, collectives. And
That's
it's about going together as a group, just like the many collaborations you've also talked about in the research. Everything is going forward together.
Yes, teamworking for me is fun.
Yeah.
I like it. It's very rewarding.
And so what tips and strategies, given you've managed these 3 different domains, what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
I guess my husband would say very badly. I'm trying to be more reasonable now, less weekend work, and trying to see it as a challenge to be able to do everything in a reasonable amount of time. Well, I think that keeping a personal life is paramount. It's very important. While I was doing my PhD, I had 3 young children, and that helped to sort of keep a balance.
Okay.
And now I have 2 grandchildren, and
Wow.
also that helps to sort of remember why you're doing what you are doing and for whom and what is important in life as well. Being in contact with nature is really important. I garden a lot. And having my hand in the earth and weeding, planting, and all that, it's really important.
Oh, so you don't let the ecological processes do the natural gardening for you?
I let it go unwillingly.
Okay. I was thinking, applied research full on in your backyard.
Yes, well, in a way, I could say that I'm having a sort of my wasteland moments in the garden. But yeah, you see how nature, how plants are so strong in a way.
Indeed.
Whatever you have a patch of earth, somebody takes the place.
Yeah.
And challenges you.
And for listeners interested, we've covered some of these kinds of processes in previous episodes as well. And we'll put a link to those in the show notes so that you can then continue the journey of nature's resilience, especially in abandoned land.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good idea to put these links.
What other advice can you offer to young scientists starting out?
Well, I don't know if I'm such a model scientist that I should give advices to young people. Well, work with people you like. Choose your research collaborations well. Be passionate about your subject. And as you said, keep time for your own enjoyment of life. That's important. Yeah, and you'll find your way. And there's many, many different ways to do science. Some people enjoy having big grants, managing big teams, and having very high H indexes and all that. And some others who do more maybe community service type of science or expertise. And all depends what you like. But it's important to keep a balance, I guess. That's great. And of course, enjoy yourself and, move also. Don't just stay at your desk. Like, come to the university by bicycle, by walk, find ways to move while you are heading for work and look at the city around you, notice things, talk to people.
See the world, experience it in many different ways.
That's it.
Yeah, solid advice. And I think something that many can then put into practice almost immediately. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
We have a university profile page, which I should put up to date. I also have my lab website, the Laboratoire sur les infrastructures vertes et bleues, so LIVB. Yeah, that's pretty it. And in my garden.
Yeah, people can come and watch how your garden has then ecologically progressed and have a chat with you at the same time.
And maybe help me weed and harvest or plant in the spring and, and all that.
No, definitely. And we'll put these links as well as others and the topics we discussed today in the show notes so that people can then read more about it. But Danielle, thank you so much for your time. And like I do with every guest, I always give my guest the final word. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
Well, to help keep or even improve the beauty of the world.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up our fun and inspiring episode with Danielle Dagenais. For all your gardening and backyard biodiversity needs, or to learn more about Montreal's wintry months and the many wonders and saltiness of urban snow management, check out the show notes for more information over at peterambach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you to you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you're enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow gardeners. Please also do subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X, formerly Twitter @PeterMBach, or Instagram @PeterMBach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Karen. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.